There is a kind of gardening knowledge that does not come from books. It comes from watching someone who has been growing things for 50 years move through a garden, the way they press soil around a transplant, the way they read a leaf before they do anything to the plant, the way they save the water from boiling eggs and pour it on the roses, the way they know without measuring anything that this bed needs something and that one does not. This knowledge lived in kitchens and back gardens and on front porches. It was passed from grandparent to grandchild, from neighbor to neighbor, through demonstration rather than instruction. And then it was quietly replaced by the idea that gardening required products, that success came from buying the right fertilizer or the right pesticide or the right soil amendment, rather than from knowing what to observe and what to do with what you observe. Some of that knowledge is now being recovered by soil scientists and organic growers and permaculture researchers who keep discovering that the old practices had sound biological reasons behind them. Other parts of it are simply waiting to be remembered by people who want to grow things well without spending money on inputs they do not need. Here are 15 of those forgotten secrets. Before the 15 secrets themselves, one observation that gives them context. The generation that used these practices was not doing so because they lacked access to modern alternatives. They were doing so because these practices worked reliably and cost nothing, and because the people who taught them had verified their effectiveness over decades of observation. When synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides became affordable in the mid-20th century, many of these practices were abandoned, not because they stopped working, but because the new products were easier and came with instructions. The instructions were simpler than the knowledge, and simplicity has its own appeal. But the knowledge produced gardens that were genuinely healthy in a different way than gardens that depended on external inputs, and that difference is what made the old practices worth remembering. Here are 15 of those forgotten secrets. Secret 1. Save and use egg water. When you boil eggs, the water that remains contains calcium carbonate dissolved from the eggshells during cooking. Calcium is one of the most important minerals for healthy plant cell walls, for root development, and for the fruit quality of tomatoes, peppers, and other calcium-hungry crops. Blossom end rot on tomatoes, that sunken dark patch at the base of the fruit, is caused by calcium deficiency in the developing fruit. Egg water, cooled to room temperature and poured directly around the roots of tomatoes, peppers, and roses, provides a free and immediate calcium supplement that grandparents used without knowing the chemistry behind it. They simply knew that plants watered with egg water looked better and fruited better than plants watered without it. Secret 2. Use coffee grounds to improve soil and deter pests. The egg water observation is also supported by a broader principle that grandparents applied intuitively without naming it. Every liquid that left the kitchen had potential value in the garden before it went anywhere else. The water from rinsing rice added starch to the soil that fed soil bacteria. The water from washing vegetables added traces of organic material and mineral dust. The cooled water from boiling pasta, if unsalted, added starch. Grandparents with large kitchen gardens and small water sources developed the habit of considering where every kitchen liquid could be most usefully directed before it was disposed of, and the garden was the recipient of significant quantities of material that modern households send directly to the drain. Secret 2. Use coffee grounds to improve soil and deter pests. Coffee grounds add nitrogen as they decompose, improve soil drainage when incorporated into heavy clay, feed the fungal networks in soil that support plant root systems, and create an abrasive surface barrier that slugs and snails are reluctant to cross. Grandparents who drank percolated coffee every morning had a steady supply of grounds for the garden and understood intuitively that they belonged in the soil rather than in the trash. The key is application in thin layers, no more than half an inch at a time, to avoid creating an impenetrable mat that water cannot penetrate. Incorporated into the soil rather than left as a surface layer, coffee grounds improve soil structure over time in ways that no purchased amendment can quite replicate. Secret 3. Plant marigolds throughout the vegetable garden as pest management. French marigolds, Tagates patula, produce theophanies in their roots, sulfur compounds that are toxic to root knot nematodes, the microscopic worms that attack the root systems of tomatoes, peppers, and many other vegetables. Grandparents who interplanted marigolds throughout their kitchen gardens were not being decorative. They were managing soil nematode populations through a biological mechanism that predated commercial nematicides by thousands of years. A solid bed of French marigolds grown for one full season before planting tomatoes reduces soil nematode populations measurably, and improves the subsequent tomato crop in ways that are difficult to attribute to any other variable. Secret 4. Water deeply and infrequently rather than shallowly and often. The marigold companion planting observation is one of the most thoroughly studied examples of what scientists now call allelopathy, the phenomenon by which plants produce chemical compounds that affect other plants and organisms in their vicinity. What makes the marigold example particularly interesting from a scientific standpoint is that the effect is not above ground and aromatic, like the companion planting effect of herbs that release volatile compounds into the air. It is underground and chemical, mediated through root exudates that change the biology of the surrounding soil. The marigolds are changing the organism community that lives in the soil around them in a way that benefits the subsequent crop. This is a fundamentally more sophisticated biological mechanism than the simple aromatic masking that explains many other companion planting effects. Secret 4. Water deeply and infrequently rather than shallowly and often. Every experienced gardener who grew up before automatic irrigation systems understood this principle from observation. Shallow, frequent watering keeps moisture in the top inch or two of soil, which is where weed seeds germinate and where soil temperature fluctuations are most extreme. Deep, infrequent watering drives plant roots downward in search of moisture, developing the deep root architecture that makes plants more drought-tolerant, more mineral accessing, and more stable in wind and rain. Grandparents watered deeply and then left the garden alone until the soil was genuinely dry at depth, and their plants developed root systems that would sustain them through summer dry spells that would kill plants grown with shallow daily watering. Secret 5. Use wood ash to raise soil pH and add potassium and calcium. Every household that burned wood in a fireplace or stove had a source of free, valuable soil amendment. Wood ash raises soil pH, making it more alkaline, which benefits brassicas, asparagus, and most fruiting vegetables. It adds potassium and calcium in immediately available form, and it deters slugs when sprinkled around vulnerable plants, because slugs absorb moisture through their skin, and the dry alkaline ash dehydrates them on contact. The key is moderation. A light dusting across the soil surface, worked in lightly, is beneficial. Heavy applications change the pH too dramatically and can harm acid-loving plants. Grandparents who grew up heating with wood applied ash to their gardens routinely, alternating it across different beds each season. Secret 6. Bury kitchen scraps directly in the garden rather than composting separately. Before compost bins became standard, kitchen scraps went directly into the garden in a practice called trench composting or pit composting. A shallow trench was dug beside a row of vegetables. Kitchen scraps including vegetable peelings, fruit cores, crushed eggshells, and coffee grounds were buried, and the soil was replaced over them. The scraps decomposed in place within weeks and released nutrients directly into the root zone of the plants beside them. No bins, no turning, no waiting for finished compost. The direct burial method is faster than conventional composting, requires no equipment, and places nutrients precisely where they are needed. It is still practiced in permaculture settings but has largely been forgotten as a mainstream kitchen garden technique. Secret 7. Companion plant onions and carrots to deter each other's pests. Trench composting has a specific advantage over conventional bin composting that experienced vegetable gardeners find valuable once they have used both methods. Because the organic material is buried directly beside the plants it is meant to benefit, the nutrients it releases are in the exact location where the nearest roots will encounter them. In conventional composting, finished compost is applied to the soil surface and must be watered down to the root zone over time, or incorporated by tilling, which disturbs soil structure. In trench composting, the roots grow toward the buried organic material and access it directly as it breaks down. This direct root to decomposition contact produces noticeably faster uptake of the released nutrients and measurably better plant response than surface compost application on equivalent material. Secret 7. Companion plant onions and carrots to deter each other's pests. Carrot fly finds its host plants by scent. Onion fly finds its host plants by scent. The aromatic compounds from onion plants mask the carrot scent that carrot flies use to locate their targets, and the carrot scent masks the onion scent that onion flies use to find their targets. Interplanting onions and carrots in alternating rows produces measurably less pest damage to both crops than growing either crop in a monoculture block. This observation was so consistent across so many kitchen gardens that it became a standard piece of gardening advice in every culture where both vegetables were grown. Modern research has confirmed the mechanism. Grandparents knew the outcome without needing to know why. Secret 8. Add diluted wood ash tea to soil for fast potassium. Wood ash dissolved in water and allowed to steep for 24 hours produces a tea that delivers potassium rapidly to plant roots. Unlike the slow-release potassium from solid ash applications, ash tea acts within days and is particularly useful during the critical period when flowering plants are setting buds and fruiting plants are developing their first fruits. Pour the diluted tea, strained and mixed with 10 times its volume of water, around the base of tomatoes, roses, and fruiting shrubs when potassium demand is highest. Grandparents who had ash from the fireplace and water from the rain barrel had everything they needed to make this application without spending anything. Secret 9. Grow comfrey in a dedicated patch and use it as a free fertilizer factory. Comfrey roots penetrate 6 feet or more into the subsoil, mining potassium, phosphorus, and trace minerals that are unavailable to shallower-rooted garden plants. Cut comfrey leaves laid around other plants as mulch release those minerals as they decompose. Comfrey leaves packed into a bucket of water and allowed to ferment for 3 to 4 weeks produce a concentrated liquid fertilizer that provides the potassium needed by fruiting plants during their productive period. Every European cottage garden maintained a comfrey patch for this purpose, and the gardeners who grew it understood that this single plant gave them a continuous supply of fertilizer for every other plant in the garden at no cost beyond a small amount of space and the effort of cutting. Secret 10. Observe plants in the morning to catch problems early. The morning garden inspection was a daily practice of every experienced gardener before the age of scheduled maintenance and weekend gardening. In morning light, which is low and directional, fungal problems visible as white powder or spots on leaves are more apparent than in the even light of midday. Slug damage appears fresh, with the slime trails still visible. Wilting from overnight root problems shows before midday. Temperatures add their own wilting effect and obscure the diagnosis. New pest infestations are at their smallest and most manageable stage. The gardener who walked their garden every morning with attention rather than with tools caught problems when they were still easy to address. The gardener who only looked on weekends always found problems that had developed beyond the easy stage. Secret 11. Use banana peels as a free potassium fertilizer. The morning observation practice also produced a specific skill that is now almost entirely absent from contemporary gardening culture, which is the ability to read plant posture. A plant that is wilting in the morning before the heat of the day is telling you something different from a plant that wilts at midday in full sun. Morning wilt in cool conditions suggests root system failure, waterlogging, or disease rather than drought stress. A plant that is unusually upright and dark green in early morning but shows slow growth is showing a different nutritional signal than one that is pale and leggy. These distinctions, which an attentive morning observer learns to read over a single season, allow for interventions that are specific to the actual problem rather than generic responses to visible symptoms. Secret 11. Use banana peels as a free potassium fertilizer. Banana peels contain significant quantities of potassium, phosphorus, and calcium. Soaked in water for 24 to 48 hours, they produce a liquid that delivers those minerals in bioavailable form directly to plant roots. Applied weekly to container tomatoes, peppers, and roses through the growing season, banana peel water maintains potassium levels that a fixed soil volume depletes faster than ground plantings. Banana peels can also be dried and ground to a powder that is incorporated into potting mix as a slow-release amendment. Grandparents who ate bananas regularly had a continuous supply of this free fertilizer material and regarded it as a natural part of the kitchen garden routine to pour the soaking water on the plants rather than down the drain. Secret 12. Use stinging nettle tea as a nitrogen fertilizer. Stinging nettles are extraordinarily high in nitrogen, iron, calcium, and magnesium. Packed into a container of water and allowed to steep for 1 to 2 weeks, they produce a liquid fertilizer that promotes rapid leaf and stem growth in nitrogen-hungry plants. Diluted 5 to 10 times with water before application, nettle tea produces a visible greening response in leafy vegetables, heavy-feeding annuals, and any plant showing signs of nitrogen deficiency. Grandparents who had nettles growing wild at the garden edge had a free nitrogen fertilizer available throughout the growing season, and the knowledge that it belonged on the vegetable beds rather than in the compost pile. Secret 13. Save seeds from your best plants, not from any plant. The specific practice that made seed saving a form of plant breeding, rather than simply plant preservation, was deliberate selection. Not saving seeds from the first tomato to ripen, or the prettiest pepper, or the largest pumpkin. Saving seeds from the most productive plant, the most disease-resistant plant, the plant that performed best in the specific conditions of that garden. Over seasons of consistent selection pressure, this produced varieties that were specifically adapted to that garden's soil, microclimate, and conditions. The tomato saved from the best plant in your garden for 5 consecutive seasons performs better in your specific conditions than any purchased variety bred under different conditions because it has been selected for exactly where it is growing. Secret 14. Make a simple cold frame from old windows to extend the season. Before heated greenhouses and grow lights, every serious kitchen gardener had at least one cold frame, typically made from whatever glass or clear plastic was available, set over a simple wooden or brick enclosure. The cold frame captures heat from the sun and moderates temperature fluctuations, creating a microclimate that is several weeks ahead of the open garden in spring and several weeks behind the frost in autumn. Seeds started under a cold frame in late winter germinate weeks earlier than those started in open ground. Summer crops protected under a cold frame in early autumn continue producing after the open garden has been touched by frost. The materials cost little or nothing, the construction requires no special skill, and the seasonal extension it provides is more valuable to the kitchen garden than almost any purchased product. Secret 15. Read plant color as a diagnostic tool. Before soil testing kits became standard and before generic fertilizer schedules became the norm, experienced gardeners read the color and condition of plant leaves to understand what the plant needed. Uniform yellowing of older leaves moving upward indicates nitrogen shortage. Yellow leaves with distinctly green veins on young new growth indicates iron or magnesium deficiency. Red or purple tinting in leaves that should be green indicates phosphorus deficiency, often triggered by cold soil that prevents uptake. Brown, crispy leaf tips and margins indicate either potassium deficiency or salt accumulation from excess fertilizer. Dark green, almost blue-green coloring combined with slowed growth indicates excess nitrogen and insufficient phosphorus. This color reading was not guesswork. It was an accumulated observational language that allowed experienced gardeners to respond specifically to what each plant was communicating, rather than applying generic treatments to undiagnosed conditions. These 15 secrets share a common quality. They require attention rather than spending. They reward observation rather than application. They work by understanding what is happening in the garden rather than by purchasing something to make it happen. The gardeners who use them were not primitive or uninformed. They were paying a kind of attention to their gardens that the modern gardening industry, which profits from the idea that plants need products rather than understanding, has been quietly undermining for decades. The garden responds to attention the same way it always has. That has not changed. What has changed is how many of us are paying it. The practical challenge for the modern gardener who wants to recover these practices is not understanding them. Each of the 15 secrets is straightforward. The challenge is building the habits of observation and resource use that make them natural rather than effortful. The gardener who remembers to save egg water while cooking, who collects coffee grounds from the morning routine, who walks the garden before breakfast rather than after dinner, who reads leaves instead of reaching for a product, is practicing a different relationship with the garden than the one that modern gardening media promotes. It requires more attention and less spending. It produces a garden that is genuinely healthy rather than repeatedly rescued, and it is available to anyone who decides to pay that kind of attention. The garden responds to attention the same way it always has. That has not changed. What has changed is how many of us are paying it. Drop a comment telling me which of these 15 secrets you already use and which one surprised you most. I read every comment. Give this a thumbs up if it gave you something valuable to bring back into your garden, and subscribe for practical, science-informed gardening knowledge every single week.